All right, friends. Hopefully, you were able to take a quick break, get some water, maybe stretch your legs, and we're on to video number 2. So, this is the United Nations Part 2. What we're going to be looking at is the other pieces. So, we talked a little bit about the General Assembly and what that meant to the United Nations. Now, we are talking about the other pieces. So, we have Security Council. Mostly, this is kind of a set aside from the General Assembly. Now, it isn't necessarily um, separate, other than when we talked about how countries like the US, China, Russia, those kind of things didn't really like the idea of having one vote, one country kind of a situation because, when you have a billion people, you tend to want to have a little more say, or when you have more money like the US, you want to have more say in how things are done. So the Security Council is kind of a check on those things. What we have is 15 members of this Security Council. 10 are non-permanent members. So those are elected by the General Assembly. So say South Sudan, right? New country, maybe they get voted into the Security Council. They serve 2-year terms. Now there's 5 permanent members of the council. So that's where your big players come in. USA, United Kingdom, Russia, China, France. Those are all permanent members. They're on the Security Council um, for forever. Now the individual person might serve a 2-year term or something like that, but the USA can appoint, or usually that runs with presidential elections. So a person might nominate their representative to the permanent council, the permanent Security Council. Excuse me. Anyways, what they do is they actually are a lot of the action arm, I guess would be the way to say it, of the General Assembly. They can do economic sanctions, they can do military actions, and 9 of the 15 members have to uh, vote on something or agree on something to make it pass. Now, it usually goes to the General Assembly of some kind to um, ratify that resolution, but to get it started, it comes out of the Security Council. So now every resolution that comes out of the Security Council does require all of the 5 permanent members, which is kind of an interesting quirk. So that's a big, big check on their power, or maybe not a check, but an added bonus, I guess would be a way to say it. A big source of power for the United Nations for those countries, and that is a big balance, I guess. Maybe that's a better way to put it. Now, not only does all 5, so if all 5 members need to pass a resolution, so they have to be 5 of the 9. Now, if any one of those members vetoes it, then the resolution's dead. So you can have, if you pass it, 9 or 5 of the 9 that vote to pass have to be the permanent members. Now, if you have one of those, obviously, I don't want to beat this. I'm suddenly thinking I'm beating this to death a little bit. But if one of those members does not want to vote on it and they veto it, then that resolution doesn't pass. And that often comes up in, say, sanctions against maybe Iran, or things that you've heard of like that, where the USA, the United Kingdom, France, maybe even China might want to do this, but Russia doesn't. So then the resolution doesn't pass, and there's no sanctions. Uh, that happens quite often. Now, what else does the UN do? They do actually have a peacekeeping force, and that comes out of the Security Council again. So they can send peacekeepers to a region. Maybe there's some armed conflict. I know I'm a little bit older, but our big one was Bosnia and Kosovo and places like that. You might have heard of Rwanda, Darfur, Somalia. Those are some of the bigger failures that the UN peacekeepers have had, where they've gone in maybe in undersized numbers and really struggled to keep the peace. They are voluntary submitted, so usually there's military members that volunteer to do that, and the countries voluntarily put in um, soldiers for that security detail. They actually did, interestingly enough, win a Nobel Prize back in 1988, and you'll see I have blue helmets. Um, in quotation marks, and that's a lot of times that's what people call the peacekeepers, is the blue helmets. Their biggest mission likely have been the Korean War, excuse me. Um, yeah, so they were part of that as well. Now you'll see here on this slide, it's just a picture of a few different soldiers. You can see the blue helmets, and that's obviously why they're called the blue helmets. They have UN all stamped all over it. It is gender equity as far as the UN peacekeepers are concerned. Yeah. All right. Next part. Consider the judicial branch of the UN is the International Court of Justice at The Hague. Now that's in the Netherlands, not New York City. Um, Basically, they are there to settle disputes between the nations. So, say they've got a border dispute, and they're, maybe it's supposed to go across this river or not cross this river. The two countries can get together and do it peaceably instead of having a war over it. Trade, obviously, if there's some disputes over trade, that would also be included. There's lots and lots of disputes. Maybe I'll throw out a bonus question: is how many disputes of that the International Court of Justice settled, let's say in the year, that's 2020, so let's go 2 years back because then you can get good data. So let's go 2018. So in 2018, how many disputes did did the court settle between member nations? Just a general number. All right. Little info: the court has 15 judges. They all serve 9-year terms. There's only one judge per nationality. And that is basically the Court of Justice. Now, the executive branch. So we've talked about the judicial, we've talked about the legislative. Now, what's considered the executive branch of the UN is the Secretariat or the Secretary General. FDR back in the day saw this position as kind of a world moderator, right? So he's going to bring nations together. He or she, sorry, is going to bring nations together and get them talking, I guess would be the way to put it, and moderate that discussion. The duties obviously would include disputes, administering peacekeeping operations, and then in organizing international conferences. I would say the primary is these first two. All right. Antonio Guterres is the current Secretary General. He was elected in 2017. And to be elected, he has to be appointed by the Security Council. Again, now that's those funky voting rules. So all 5 permanent members of the Security Council have to approve. Plus, then it goes to the General Assembly, and he has to be voted, or he or she has to be voted in. The Secretary General cannot be from one of the 5 permanent nations. So the U.S. will never have a Secretary General, or Russia or China. And then they serve 5-year terms, and they can do that twice for 2 terms. So it's a maximum of 10 years service. Okay, so the last slide here is just kind of talking about some miscellaneous info. So it has a number of specialized institutions. Probably the one that we've heard about the most in the last, say, year is the World Health Organization. They set guidelines and work with member nations to work on pandemics, health concerns in that nation, that kind of stuff. Atomic Energy Agency, they do the inspections of different countries. You probably heard Iraq back in the day doing inspections. I know that with Iran, they're doing inspections, and it's really working on non-proliferation. So trying to keep those nuclear weapons from spreading. As far as funding goes, each assessment, so every country's bill, is based on their ability to pay. And that is what's a lot of people consider a very fair way to do it. If a country can't pay. Now, when you go out to dinner with your friends and you're splitting the bill, if you do it on their ability to pay, it doesn't always seem fair because maybe one country's using more or eat, in this case, the example of going out to dinner would be eating more, maybe ordering a more expensive meal. So there's adjustments there. Now, the USA accounts for about 22% of the UN budget. It's a little bit hard to tell exactly how much they contribute and how much goes into that because, peacekeeping costs can fluctuate, and we have a very large portion of the peacekeeping force. So it's a little bit tricky. The closest amount that we can get is about $3 billion. That is what the U.S. provides to the UN every year, or at least within the last year, give or take. And that is pretty much it. Hopefully you had a nice day and enjoy the weather outside. Stop staring at a screen. Take care.